Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today I'm saying hello to Ken Lane. Hey Ken, how are you doing?
I'm doing great today, Eric. Thank you.
And you are over there. That's
somewhere
the
right there.
background I
Yes.
put in.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for joining. What we want to do today is we want to talk about kind of API scope, I would say. So some people say external, internal APIs. Other people like the idea of talking about private, partner, public APIs. So let's just dig into this and figure out a little bit what these, let's say, classifications or labels can mean. What have you encountered when you talk to people who want to kind of talk a little bit about that scope, like who's consuming it, where is it exposed, and so forth?
I would say the most common, and this is a top concern of most companies I talk to, is the most common is really just internal and external, or public and private. People, inside the firewall, outside the firewall, because there is some perceived trust or boundaries, and safety that exists. I don't think that's always real and a reality. But I think people perceive it. But I think the more traditional, from an API service provider's vantage point, that really maps to what customers view is private, partner, and public. So I guess a 3Ps kind of stance is, hey, this API is only for private usage, internals, not to leave the firewall. Hey, we integrate with partners and work with partners on this, but it's not for public consumption or viewing. And then, hey, this is just publicly available. Those are, I think, are the classic boundaries that I would see.
I've certainly heard, I think, the same terms being used, but there's one interesting case I think I just encountered recently when I spoke with Matthew Reinbold, and he talked about GraphQL and that GraphQL is only for, and then we got into the situation, right? Because I think he said internal and private. So my point there was that in many cases where I see GraphQL being used, for example, it's for private APIs, but not necessarily for internal use, right? So it's APIs that get consumed by, let's say, your mobile app or your web app, but it's still exposed openly because, well, it needs to go wherever that app is running, right? So in that case, we have that situation where we have a private API, but it's not internal, so to speak. How would you describe that kind of difference there in terminology a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that actually gets at the kind of core of the problem or the challenge or the insecurity of it is that a lot of companies I work with, I've worked with a lot of enterprise groups that have a very popular mobile application, and I go to talk to them about their API efforts, not putting any label on it or anything. Just, hey, I want to engage with you about your APIs, and they immediately come back and go, well, we don't have any public APIs. And I said, well, that's interesting, because here's a open API definition for all of your APIs. But where'd you get that? How did you hack in something? I'm like, no, I use your app, and I just proxied it through Charles Proxy on my desktop. And as I was using it, I just kind of outputted and mapped out the APIs that were being called as part of the application. And here it is, and if I use my auth with my cookies, I can authenticate with it. So it's using public DNS. So it's a public API in my sense. They're like, oh, well, no, we don't have a public API program where you can sign up and use it. And I'm like, well, I mean, I agree. That's your business positioning, but you should probably view it as a public API from a security vantage point, even if you consider who has access to it being a little more selective.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, I think. But in that case, I think I would rather say external because it's externally exposed, even though the intention was to make it private. And I think to some extent that differentiation can be important because like a little while ago, I spoke about, designing private, partner, public APIs. And in my mind, the most important thing there was not so much security considerations, but just a difference in who you design for, right? If I design for like internal consumption, so to speak, or private consumption, it's called this, right? If I design for private consumption, then I can make different design considerations because maybe people know the domain better, they know the space that the API is designed in, right? So I can probably expose a different model than if I designed a public API where I have to make it very easy to grasp. I cannot count on people knowing the space very well. So in my mind, the differences actually were more on the kind of design side of things, not so much in terms of how you secure it or exactly how you expose it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would position it more as an awareness of who's using it and consuming it, and then yes, designing for that based upon that awareness. Because if you're in the API management business, I would say if people don't have an awareness of who's going to consume it and use it, and aren't designing thoughtfully for that, they're probably not as far along in their API management journey as other companies or organizations I speak with. And because people who don't really understand that line between private, partner, public, and understand that you can, secure, you can authenticate, and you can require, developers to get keys, and who your consumers are. That's really how you kind of draw those lines, is with API management, in my experience. So yeah, I would say it's about knowing your users and knowing who your consumers of your API are, and intentionally designing or building and providing that API for them. And I think it's interesting that you talked about GraphQL in that respect, because I think GraphQL is another bubble that some people exist in, where, hey, we're building an API for yes, for a specific audience, and they're like, this is great. This is all you ever need. But they're like within that one bubble of single page apps being built on this, and they're not thinking about other types of usage. Maybe that's the only type of user that they should be designing for, and that's the right choice. GraphQL is the right choice for that. But I think if that's not a deliberate choice that you made, that, hey, we're building an app for a known group of users who have this certain skills, understand our schema and our building, and need access to the full surface area of the resources without design being part of it, they can just request what they need, then that's the right choice. But if you're building for a much wider audience, that maybe there's some unknowns in there, apps that maybe aren't single page apps or mobile apps, React or other things, then I think you should be thinking a little differently about your design process. What do you think?
Thanks for saying that, because it was interesting when I posted that video a little while ago about private, partner, public, and that you probably should approach that little with a different mindset because you have different consumer populations. I did get some pushback where people saying no, like there's one true way how to design a good API, and it shouldn't matter who's consuming it. And that to me was so confusing. It's like that's the opposite of what you would do for any other product, where you would say, well, in order to design a good product, you need to know who's using it, what their constraints are, what their capabilities are, what their context is, and then you can design it for them. And it probably will work well for them and probably not so well for others that you didn't have in mind. And it just seemed that this very general idea of what design is as a process, some people seem to think that doesn't apply to APIs. And I just found that confusing, I have to admit.
Yeah, well, I mean, the way that I hear you describe design, which I really like, is it's a much more thoughtful upstream thing that you do. And I would bundle what I said about security underneath that. Like you're gonna design your security based upon what's being built with this API, how this API is intentionally being put forth. And so design isn't just the naming and ordering of your API or a specific pattern. It's I would say lifecycle encompassing to a certain degree, and the decisions you make early on are going to affect testing, are going to affect security, are going to affect all the apps downstream. And so design is, I think we get the ideology around API first and API design and the dogma around specific patterns and approaches, hypermedia, GraphQL, all of that, I think tends to get in our way of really thoughtful design for human purposes. So.
Yes, I would definitely agree to this. I think there's quite a bit of kind of techno determinism in there. It's like, if I use some technology, that's going to be great because I'm using that technology. And that's a weird conclusion to make, I think.
No, go ahead.
No, so what I wanted to say is just that I'm happy that you see it in the same way, that kind of the design is a purposeful process with the consumer in mind. And I think that's also where, in the end, this difference between public, partner, private, and external, internal can be made pretty clear, where you say, when you say public, partner, private, that clearly a consumer focus where you look at who's consuming it. And then internal, external basically is just, does it go inside? Does it go outside of the firewall or not? So that's much more, to me, it's much more like an infrastructure consideration, which is important, but it's not the same thought process thinking about the consumer, right? It's just like, does it stay inside my fortress or doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think a lot of those things are based upon lines we perceive about safety and security and of the corporate firewall, of the enterprise firewall, versus being out there in public. And I know you and I have kind of lived similar lives for the last number of years, where we're very public about our storytelling and our personas and what we do and how we travel and what we eat and stuff like that. And I don't think people are used to that. I don't think a lot of people think in that way about their personal lives or their professional lives, let alone doing business out in the open, that you're supposed to keep most of that behind the firewall. And I've seen a lot of people who, Pinterest, I would say, is one of the high profile ones I saw make this statement, is when asked before they had a public API, asked about their public API, they said, well, we want to be very thoughtful about our API. We don't want to make the same mistakes as Twitter. And I was, what mistakes did Twitter make? I'm really curious to hear. I mean, I know of plenty, but they've also made lots of good decisions too. And they have the Twitter API is definitely one of the more important APIs I feel out there. Personally, I feel there's a massive amount of lessons there, good and bad, of how you should think about your API and think about your community. And they're working real hard to clean up and some of the poor decision making they've made in the past. But some companies are like, just saw the act of being very public and open by default for your API as a mistake. And they just aren't comfortable with that from a business perspective. And I would say that's why we have the microservices kind of internal swell right now, is because a lot of people pulled back from that line and didn't do external or public APIs, and they're doubling down on internal and partner ones.
But I think for some companies, I can understand when, for most companies we talk to, they're really not interested in public APIs. And I can understand it from their business point of view. But at least partner APIs, which I think there is a blurry line between partner and public APIs, right?
Yeah.
And I think partner APIs is something that pretty much every company now should be thinking hard about.
Yeah.
So, like you said, right? Like, if you have this fundamental idea of APIs are only for our consumption, only for private consumption, that I think that becomes a problem if that also then excludes partner APIs. And that is, I think, what happens fairly often.
Yeah. And I think that line for people, I consider public APIs and partner APIs the same thing. I just think folks are being less honest and less forthright about the information around them, perceiving that, hey, if we put forth the documentation or share the open API publicly, that our competitors are going to snatch it and do exactly what we're doing, or they're going to know how we're, it's business intelligence. And I'm like, yeah, I guess so to a certain degree, but I would hope that you're iterating and evolving fast enough that is defensible, that's not your secret sauce, and that your API management layer, I mean, they can't see what partners have access. They can't see how much partners consume and access and put to use or don't put to use. So there's still a lot, even if you have a public API portal for your partner APIs and you're sharing them, there's still a lot you can't see. And if your authentication and authorization's tight and your security's tight, it shouldn't matter. But again, I think it's around the perceptions of how people view things, that this is for a select audience and it's not public.
Definitely, I think it makes people feel a little safer, that they at least has some parameter around it, right? It's not open. It's at least that we have some control over it. I think that creates a lot of safety, mental safety, right, for people. It's like, well, even if it is kind of almost public, it's not quite. And if something goes wrong, we could say we never intended it to be public or something like that. Sometimes, yeah. I think
it's control. I think the word control, you said, people feel better when they have control over things, and especially in a world where we don't have control over a lot of things around us. So I think having control just makes people feel better.
And I think the same, to kind of close the loop, also applies to this internal external thing, where, as you said, I think it's sometimes the difference in security may be much more kind of almost like, I would say, folklore. It's like the good old days where everything was unsafe outside of the firewall and everything was safe inside of the firewall. Those days are long gone, right? I think I forgot the number, but it's like 70% of all the hacking problems, like, they occur internally, right? They originate internally. So like this whole idea that only because you secure things inside your firewall, you're fine, I think that sometimes is also a little bit more of a feeling of control and the ability to say, look, we tried to secure it, but it may not actually make such a huge difference.
Well, and every enterprise has that, as you said, folklore myth, or not really a myth, but folklore about that one breach or that one person who messed up in the past and caused, all of these issues and problems. And everyone's just constantly, remembering that and thinking, oh, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that next person to have it on my watch. And I get it, like at scale, in these large 1,000-person enterprises, it's tough for every person to understand, should this be accessible outside? Should this be not? Is it personally identifiable information? Is it proprietary? Is it, secret sauce? And that's tough to scale. So I think, again, I think this is why a good API design process is so critical, because you can have these conversations with everyone at the table early on, right? And be doing this ahead of time. I mean, I like your vision of design being kind of such an upstream, comprehensive, meaningful activity, because if it's I think so many developers see it as just, hypermedia or just REST and designing, and it's so not. It's so about having a conversation about, the parts and the pieces and what we're going to put out there, that I think people would feel a lot more comfortable and feel like they have a lot more control if they approached the API lifecycle through a design lens early on, and then you would mitigate a lot of these downstream negative impacts that tend to happen, whether it be, security related, performance, other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said, if you don't focus too much on these technical things, which at some point are important, but that's relatively late, right? Then you can also have these conversations at a earlier time and also at a more important time, and say, look, we are designing this product, right? This is what it's meant to do. Here's what goes in, here's what comes out. is there a problem? And I think if you have this kind of level where you can discuss things,
Sorry.
I see you have a guest.
We're discussing things
this
early on before someone enters the door, I think. So yeah.
Okay. I think if you have this level of conversation early on, right, it's also something where it's not so hard for somebody to understand what's going on and to tell you, hey, you should think about that because that is personally identifiable information or these kind of things. Or you could say, okay, that isn't, so let's move on with that. And I think the further down you first go into kind of the trenches of all the technical details, where then it becomes harder actually to have these conversations, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think design is not just about, hey, is this API we're putting out there well designed, or sometimes it involves the API we didn't put out there, right? Like that's a good designed API as well. The one that we realize, well, wait, we really don't understand what we're doing here, who our target audience is, and the information we're going to expose here. We just don't have enough information. Maybe the stakeholders aren't at the table. Let's not do this API. I think that's a design workflow that should be followed a lot more in a lot of organizations I work with. But unfortunately, I don't always get what I want. So
that is very true. Yes, there probably are a lot of APIs out there where you could say, yeah, this API should not have seen the light of day, and others should have been there instead.
Yeah,
but you always get smarter afterwards, I think. So it's a little easy in the end to make this kind of statement, but there's definitely, I think, a good number of examples like that.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, the design process is very much about these conversations and talking to folks and helping make sure everyone's on the same page. And Google wrote a white paper. I need to pull this up and find it because I reference it every once in a while. They did a white paper on operating your enterprise like there is no internal at all. Treating everything, it's kind of, I would say, early zero trust kind of approaches and looking at it like that. But, not that everybody should always be on pins and needles and feeling helpless and like they don't have control outside the firewall, because that can be scary for some people. I think as you were saying, people need some sort of level of comfort and trust, but I still think it's a healthy exercise to look at the world like that. As you said, the largest percent of breaches and that we experience are done because of some internal situation or actor or situation. So I think it's just a healthy thing to think about, and we should have more conversations around it.
And that reminds me a lot of the Bezos memo and then the fallout of that, right? Where the original memo said every API has to be designed so that it's potentially externalizable. So that's a good starting place, yeah. Maybe. And then the other thing I found interesting was that also all these posts after the memo came out that describe what Amazon was going through, they very much focus on, and that actually meant we needed to have different monitoring, different kind of security mechanisms, because you just couldn't be as sure as before that everything goes well. So you had to build in that tooling, and that had to become part of the API fabric everywhere, not just for the externally exposed APIs, but everywhere, because you also don't know exactly who's consuming your API internally. So if their program goes berserk, right, it may take down your system. So you better build in some defenses even against internal, maybe not attackers, but internal threats that can be very real, I think.
Well, and not just security. I mean, in my opinion, every API should have a management layer and have some sort of token and keys. I don't care if it's internal, private, partner, whatever label you're put on. There should be logging. There should be a traceability, some sort of observability on that. And from a security, I think it's super critical. As you said, we don't know who's actually using it. When you think about, high profile breaches like the Equifax one, where, something was launched just for a contest, I think it was, and it was an ephemeral temporary API, but then it never got shut down, and it was perceived as being just with a limited set of partners. But it never got shut down and it never got dealt with. And I think that lack of observability hurts people. But I feel like I'm always advocating that I do this a lot in government agencies is you should have API management. And they're like, well, we're not allowing just wide public access to this. I'm like, well, who uses it? And they're like, well, we don't really know. It's just other agencies and other internal groups. And I'm like, so you don't meter usage and send them an invoice? And they're like, oh no, we're not monetizing government APIs between groups internally. And I'm like, well, why wouldn't you measure value exchange? I'm not saying charge them. I'm saying show them that value exchange, send them an invoice and say, hey, you're using X amount of our resources, and those resources take money to stand up and keep the computer, the servers up in the database. And don't you want to like justify that with your bosses that, hey, we've got, the NOAA, the National Oceanic, using our API. We've got, this other group. And they're like, wow, we just hadn't thought of API management that way. We purely saw API management as this external that you launch a portal, you do this public documentation, developers sign up. I'm like, no, like invoice your internal groups and show that value exchange internally that's happening.
Yeah, I think the invoicing part is important, understanding what value exchange is going on. And then, like you said, also some kind of basic auditing, I would say, just knowing what's going on, right? And see, well, there's a surprising number of API calls over here. Let's have a look, right? That could be interesting information. For example, you have, I think that was the Equifax case, right? Where they had some systems then siphoning off information, those APIs for a long time. Wasn't that the Equifax thing where that was actually had been going on for months or years?
Yeah, it was almost a year, I think.
Yeah, right. So clearly nobody ever looked at this API and somebody just happily used it the whole time. Right? So it's like, yeah, maybe management would have been nice there. So,
yeah, I've seen like Department of Commerce APIs where they're like, oh, this is great. We have a handful of users, but we're probably going to shut it down next year. And because, it's only got about 15, 20 users. And then someone raises their hand and go, well, wait, we're with the General Services Administration. We're heavily dependent on that API. And we're one user, yes, but we're an important user. So like, please don't shut it down. And because that feedback loop didn't exist, because they didn't have a management layer, and that I always find is the biggest crime of that not being present is you don't have that feedback loop opportunity. I remember when Census realized that with their data, their APIs, because 2010, I think it was by mid 2011, they launched APIs. But before that, they were, well, we can't have APIs because if we design an API, we're actually putting our opinion on the survey data. And we're supposed to, so, the census goes out and surveys the United States, and we're supposed to remain neutral and not apply our perspective. And the process of designing an API and endpoints would be us putting our opinion on it. I'm like, well, I get that. I guess, I can agree with that, but you're really missing out on understanding what people are doing with the data. And as soon as they did, and they lit up these feedback loops, they realized, oh, we have this whole world of people who want the data and try to use it, but don't have the compute capacity to download a big file and process it, these massive terabyte survey files. So by giving them endpoints and allowing them to just get the Northeast region of the US and do the selecting through the API, they realized they had all these economists and all these people who that they could talk to. And because they had this feedback loop in place, these were more talkative people who were going to give them feedback, where the developers who had the resources to just download and crunch it, they had zero interest in talking and providing feedback to the census about it. So just the fact that they stood up APIs, had API management layer, created that feedback loop. And it's still the top way that they're getting feedback and kind of evolving and making the census better. So
yeah, that feedback part I think is super important to have that. It's just right when you think about like when designing partner APIs, it's the same kind of thing, right? You should probably sit down with actual partners and ask them, what do you want? And then that probably helps you to better understand their needs and the usage patterns and these kind of things, right? So go out and then you actually start your design exercise with the people you're designing for, which I think sometimes really gets a little bit forgotten.
Yeah. Well, I coming up on time here. I'm gonna have to jump soon, but I would love to see. I mean, I think your show, you do a great job interviewing many voices from the community. I would love to see you keep unpacking this concept of your design vision being more holistic and trying to help. I think there's a lot of developers who see design as being REST, and I think most of the API design books out there are REST. And I would love to see us as a community unpack that and go, no, this is about thoughtful design upstream, having a conversation, mitigating downstream impacts and negative things. But I'm stoked having this conversation with you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we actually we at least we did put a little bit of clarity around external, internal, and private partner public. But regardless of our end result, it was a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I don't think we're going to solve the partner public. I think I think the words mean different things to different folks. So I think coming out of it at a design that design is the critical piece of that, so we can talk about who's using it and what the outcomes are and the intents are. I think that's more important than us ever truly solving or settling in on the right words. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much and have a good one. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Eric.